Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. Will we truly ever know who he was? Can historians separate fact from fiction? Is the Mozart portrayed in the movie Amadeus the real Mozart, or just a buffoon dreamt up by Hollywood?
Well, Mozart's life, I think, is particularly interesting because, well, especially, I suppose, with all this Amadeus, which I thought was I must say, was a fun movie. It annoyed me that it had to be so inaccurate, because I thought the accurate story would have been just as interesting, if not more.
The truth is, famous people throughout history tend to be remembered not as how they really were, but how we wish them to have been. Rumor and innuendo are far juicier than fact and reality. In the case of Mozart, the truth lies somewhere in the middle.
If you look at Mozart's scatological canons, these little short pieces he wrote to his sister with dirty limericks in them, you can say, okay, there is that side of him. That doesn't make him Tom Hulse in Milos Forman's Amadeus. He doesn't turn out necessarily as a giggling lunatic as a result of this. There was this side. He had a playful side, and he played billiards, and he probably chased the odd skirt. He was very much a man of his time and of his world. But I think to characterize him as a vulgarian as a result of this is going too far.
The other side of him is he did marry, and he was, as far as we know, reasonably faithful to his wife. He was very conscientious about her health, and he sent her, even when he was very sick, he sent her to Baden because she had lost a baby. So, I mean, there was also this other child side to him that was very caretaking and very loving.
Mozart's mythical life is full of contradictions and continues to be scrutinized long after his premature death at the age of 35 on the 5th of December in 1791. He died of heart failure brought on by an infectious virus. Penniless and in debt, he was given a third-class funeral and buried in an unmarked grave that held 5 other coffins. A sad ending to a man blessed with musical perfection.
There are very few things in one's own journey that, certainly mine, that where I am absolutely in complete humility. It's so unique. It's like watching, it's like going and watching a Rembrandt picture. You say, how did he do that? How did this guy write these notes down without any mistakes?
Imagine in a much more prosaic way a guy who writes newspaper articles, who just writes. He types it and faxes it and doesn't do anything else, doesn't change a word, doesn't make a correction, doesn't change the paragraphing, he just sends it off. That to me is totally inconceivable. So how much more inconceivable is it that someone does that with a piece of music?
Mozart was born in Salzburg, Austria on January 27, 1756. His father, Leopold Mozart, was a respected composer and teacher of the Archbishop's court. When the young Wolfi hit the ripe old age of 3, he could already play little melodies on the clavichord. His father heard more than just music. He heard opportunity loudly knocking.
Mozart had a very frustrating life in a way. I mean, I think one of the worst things he had was he didn't have a childhood because he was trotted around Europe as this precocious young prodigy, and sat on the knees of empresses and queens and kings and whatever, played the piano divinely, and probably was a terrible brat as a child. I mean, I think if he were put into a normal school with ordinary kids, they would have killed him straight away.
Will the world ever see a child prodigy like Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart again?
Who knows? And would we recognize the prodigy if we saw it? We might not.
I think he was a freak of nature. I think he was born a genius that is hard to comprehend. Only one every 500 years maybe has that ability.
As we've seen with Mozart, being a child prodigy can be exhilarating, but also traumatic.
The reason I survived is because I had so many other interests, and I had parents that understood that and didn't put me in a bubble. And I think I've seen some terrible, tragedies really with incredibly talented performers who just burned out or just left music altogether because it was just too much pressure as early on.
There's a certain level of talent that can be realized at a certain age to everybody's delight and everybody's wonderment. But the road between that stage of the game and of being a consistent, reliable adult artist is very, very long and arduous, and very few actually make it.
Well, actually, my very first professional concert when I was 14 years old with the Philadelphia Orchestra was my debut, and I was very concerned about it. It was my first time with a major orchestra, and I was kind of in awe of the Philadelphia Orchestra. And during the first performance, just before the cadenza of the Mozart Violin Concerto, I had a rubber band that would keep my shoulder pad on, and it came loose, and I had about a few seconds to stretch the rubber band to secure it before my cadenza, and as I was doing it, somehow I accidentally let go, and the rubber band smacked one of the violists in the face,
Mozart began writing music at the age of 4. At 7, his first compositions were being published. At 8, he wrote his first symphonies. By the time he was 17, he was considered a mature composer.
I think what made Mozart great was not what he did at 6 or 7, but what he did at 30 and 31. And precocity in the end doesn't really matter, because certainly 200 years later, what's the difference if he wrote this stuff at 17 or at 31? As if we could say, well, of course he didn't do that until he was 30, so it's completely comprehensible.
Mozart was blessed with an abundance of talent. His music was elegant, graceful, refined, and always filled with passion. Of passions, Mozart once said, whether violent or not, they should never be expressed when they reach an unpleasant stage. This belief led to some of his contemporaries saying his music was too delicate and lacked the oomph needed to be truly great. Whichever of Mozart's contemporaries called his music too delicate, obviously hadn't heard that concerto. In fact, it has an almost operatic quality, and Mozart's favorite musical form was opera.
Osservate leggete con me, osservate, leggete con me.
Mozart's favorite instrument was the piano, which he loved to play and write for. Many of his piano concertos rank as the best ever written. Beethoven would later give him a run for his money, but old Ludwig wrote only 5 piano concertos compared to Mozart's 27.
The concerto is a fairly new thing when Mozart is writing. A lot of experimentation going on. How do we deal with the fact that we have this theme and the orchestra will introduce it? Then what's the piano going to do? Is it going to reintroduce it? Is it going to do something else? How is it going to announce itself? And Mozart, naturally being Mozart, everything he tries is immediately successful.
There's such fantastic music in him. And in some ways, it's impossible to understand how he could write so much good music so regularly. And so many, I mean, I think in some 3 or 4 year period, he wrote 12 piano concertos, and each one is a masterpiece.
A piano concerto is when the soloist sits in front of the orchestra and is featured throughout the performance. Now, the good Mozart didn't invent the piano concerto, but what he did do was revolutionize it.
It's all perfect. That's what people say, and I think that's what they mean. That every note makes sense. Every note has a meaning.
He used the same vocabulary as the other 5,000 composers who lived in Vienna and Salzburg. But he made better and greater music than they did.
What's important about Mozart is that he is the master of making the predictable not happen. You always know where you are, but you don't know where he's going. And the music is so inventive, so imaginative, so shockingly imaginative without being unnatural. This is music that stands apart.
I don't mind if people call it Elvira Madigan. You know, if they go to a concert because the Elvira Madigan concerto is on and they listen to Mozart, fine. You know, it never worries me. Beethoven's Moonlight was not called Moonlight by Beethoven. And names often get onto compositions without the composer writing it down.
But I think that music for him was almost like he was a vessel for it. He said many times that all he was doing was taking dictation from the angels. I mean, that's a comment of his.
Mozart's 20th Piano Concerto in D minor clearly has a stormy atmosphere. And yet, in the same year, he composed the 21st Piano Concerto in C major. In this work, the sun comes through the clouds, and Mozart makes you believe there truly is a God in heaven.
He lived his life with a certain sense of failure. He did not live his life with a sense of lacking worth. He knew he was better than the others, and he was frustrated by the fact that the world wasn't willing to recognize it.
The minute he picked up a pencil to write something, you can tell immediately. He had this uncanny ability that no one else has had. So was he a messenger of classical music? I think he was a messenger of God, a messenger of a power that we all adhere to and should. Because if we don't, we are denying ourselves something very beautiful.
To many, Mozart was considered nothing more than a talented servant who entertained the privileged, something he had been doing since he was 4 years old and right up to his premature death. It's mind-boggling to hypothesize about what kind of music he would have composed had he only lived longer. Would it have been as perfect? We'll never know. And perhaps we're better off not knowing.